end of the fingers to the end of the elbow. That's 1 cubit. It's about 18 inches more or less, and that's the measurement that's used in the tabernacle. For example, the table was a cubit by 2 cubits by 1.5 cubits. The altar was a cubit by 2 cubits high. The menorah doesn't have any cubits on it, so we don't know exactly how big it was. The building is 10 cubits high. Okay, the panels are 1.5 cubits wide. So those are the measurements that are given, right? So this is life size. The tabernacle is divided to 3 areas: the courtyard, holy place, holy of holies. The entrance into the courtyard was allowed to all the Levites, and here only priests. Into the Holy of Holies, only the high priest, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. Inside the holy place, you have the menorah, the table of the altar. The menorah was made out of 1 piece of solid gold with no measurements, no cubits are given on it. But it was the source of light. It had 3 branches off of either side. It had the 7 oil lamps on the top, and this was the only thing that was giving light. The menorah was against the southern wall. Okay, the tabernacle was always built in the same directions: north, south, east, west. Menorah against the southern wall. Directly in front of it on the north, table of showbread made out of acacia wood, covered with gold, had 12 breads on it. The bread that represents the 12 tribes of Israel and how God looks after them and cares for them. This is also the bread that the priests had to eat every Shabbat, every Sabbath. The priests would be eating this bread. New ones were made. Just put, the next one would be put on, and again kept for another week. If you remember the story of David when he's running away from Saul, when he's in Nova and he meets a priest who's holding bread, and David is asked to eat from it. It's talking about the same bread, the bread that was supposed to be for the table, but David eats from it anyway. And here the altar of incense, again also made out of acacia wood, covered with gold, but this altar is only for incense. So the fire was brought from outside, from the altar of sacrifice, and here, and this is where the priest would light incense in the morning and in the evening every day, right? That's one of their continuous duties. Morning and evening sacrifice outside, morning and evening lighting the incense, and morning and evening tending to the lamp, okay? Over here we have the clothing described for the priest and the high priest. So the priest wore a white hat, white tunic, white pants, and a colored sash on his waist. The high priest also wore a white hat, white tunic, white pants, and a sash on his waist. But he also wore a golden band on his forehead that says, Kodesh Adonai, holy or holiness of the Lord. Over his white clothing he wore a blue robe, and on the hem of the blue robe a golden bell and pomegranate. Over his upper body the ephod. The ephod is like a vest, which had 2 stones on it, 2 avnei shalom, 2 onyx stones. The stones were tilted a little bit to the front. You could read them from the front. And engraved onto them were the 6 names and 6 names of the children of Israel according to their age, according to their birth. It was holding up the choshen. This is the breastplate, which had 12 stones on it and 1 name engraved onto every stone. Again, he's wearing this because it's his job as the high priest to be representing these people. The nation of Israel are bringing him sacrifices, offerings, and he's serving them in the holy work by sacrificing and doing the work for them. And once a year, he can enter into the Holy of Holies. That's only on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. And on that day, there are many sacrifices, but the first 3 sacrifices are prepared a little bit differently, so I usually explain about those. The very first sacrifice was for the sins of the high priest, right? Before anything else happens, the high priest first has to atone for his own sins. By the way, the word in Hebrew for atone is lechaper, which means to cover, right? So it means the covering of sin. So I didn't talk about this all the time, but at the altar of sacrifice, God says, I give to you the blood on the altar in order to cover your sins, Leviticus chapter 17. So he first has to cover his own sins, he first has to pay for his own sins, and only later for the sins of Israel. So again, for him was a bull sacrifice, that was the first one, and there were 2 goat sacrifices, they were both sin sacrifices, they were both for the sins of Israel, and they're both goats. So how does he choose which one is the goat to the Lord, the blood from that was taken in, and which one is the scapegoat, which was taken to the desert, led into the desert and they would die there? Well, he would do it by the Urim and Tumim. So if you look at the breastplate over here, there are measurements that are given on the breastplate, given in spans. This is 1 cubit, this is 1 span. The breastplate was 1 span by 2 spans long, folded in half to create a pocket, and that's where the Urim and Tumim were kept. And he would cast lots using the Urim and Tumim on the 2 animals to see which one is the scapegoat and which one is the goat to the Lord. It wasn't only used for that, it was used throughout actually for different things whenever he needed to receive an answer. But he would cast lots on those 2 animals. The goat to the Lord was taken in along with the blood from the bull sacrifice, and the scapegoat was taken to the desert with the sins of Israel. Before he can enter, he takes from the fire, takes 2 handfuls of incense, and he lights it inside the Holy of Holies, so the room is filled before he enters, and then he changes into his white clothing. He wears this clothing every day of the year, including on the Day of Atonement, but this clothing was made for glory and for beauty, right? So he has to take it off, not dress so fancy when he's entering into God's presence. He dresses simply and humbly, wearing white clothing. He enters inside with the blood. All right? So let's continue inside the Holy of Holies. Alright, so the tabernacle is divided to 3 areas: courtyard, holy place, holy of holies. The entrance to every one of these is the eastern side, and it's always a colored screen with white, blue, purple, and red. This is the third screen. It's a little bit different because it has its own name. It's called the parochet, which is the name of this specific screen, which was dividing between the holy and the holy of holies. So past it, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The Ark was made out of acacia wood. It was covered with gold. It was a cubit and a half by cubit and a half by 2.5 cubits. Had a solid gold covering. That's the kaporet, from the same word we talked about before, which means to cover. So it's called the covering of the Ark, the kaporet. That was also a cubit and a half by 2.5 cubits, and had one cherubim on either end, with their bodies one towards the other, their faces downward, and their wings spread up and over the Ark. Inside the Ark, you had the 2 stone tablets. These were the second stone tablets. The first ones were broken by Moses, and the second ones were put inside. Inside the Holy of Holies, you had 3 more things. You had a bowl with manna, which was to remind the children of Israel of how God provided for them when they were wandering in the wilderness. And you also had the staff of Aaron, which was to remind the children of Israel not to rebel against God. And then you had one more thing. This is usually overlooked. It's from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31. That's where it says that when Moses finished writing the Torah, the books of Moses, it says that he takes the book, he gives it to the Levites, and he tells the Levites to put it alongside of the ark. Okay, so that was put in here as well. Now back to the high priest. He's dressed in white. He lights incense in here. Why does he light incense? If you look in chapter 25 of Exodus, the first thing that's described in the tabernacle is the ark. And at the end of the description of the ark, God tells Moses, I will speak to you and I will meet with you from between the cherubims and the covering of the ark. So you're not supposed to see the appearance of God. That's why the high priest lights incense, so that his vision is obstructed, because God would appear in the cloud of incense that is above the ark. So he takes the blood that's with him, sprinkles the blood 7 times towards the east on the covering of the ark, 7 times in front of the ark, 7 times in the corners of the incense and the altar of sacrifice. And then he would change back into his regular clothing, and then he continues with a lot more work, but that was outside. Okay, and here was just the sprinkling that we talked about.